Paper 2, the Liberal Reforms. The Liberal Reforms can be broken down into several areas: the causes of the reforms themselves, and how effective they were. By the turn of the 20th century, by the time the Liberals come into power in 1906, there's a change in belief about why people are poor. Previously, it was thought that people were poor because it was their own fault. They were lazy, they spent their money on alcohol and on cigarettes, and it was their own fault. Soon, things began to change. People began to realise that it was not their own fault, and it was down to large families, disabilities, death of fathers, unemployment, and illness. Because of these things, actions were taken to improve the lives of poor people. There were things available to them at the time. So there was indoor relief and outdoor relief, where people could go into a workhouse, which was unpleasant and horrible, but it was better than having nowhere at all to go, or food and clothing was taken to the people in their own homes. The other thing that was available to people were the work of private charities. There were charities like the Salvation Army, like Dr. Barnardo's for Children, and in London there were between 700 and 800 of these private charities. However, under the Liberal government of 1906 to 1914, reforms were brought in, and there are several reasons for this. The first is the work of the social investigators, Charles Booth and Seaburn Rowntree. These two people investigated the conditions in which poor people lived. They interviewed doctors, they went to see things for themselves in York and in London, and they found that on average about 30% of the people were living below the poverty line. That was, they didn't have enough money to survive and live decently. They published their findings, they wrote articles in newspapers, and they tried to pressurise the government in particular to change things. The second reason that the reforms were brought in was because of the work of the New Liberals, a new breed of politician that wanted to help the poor people more. The previous attitudes of laissez-faire and not interfering had gone. New Liberals like Winston Churchill and David Lloyd George wanted to actually help the people, and therefore promoted policies that could be brought in and laws could be changed to help poor people out. A third reason is because of national efficiency. Britain at the time was still one of the most important and most powerful countries in the world. However, that was beginning to change. Germany and America had started to take over Britain's position as being the best, strongest, richest country in the world. Germany had its own welfare state. It had pensions, it looked after people. Britain tried to copy that. The other reason that they needed to improve national efficiency was because of industry, and America and Germany were becoming so economically powerful that Britain was falling further and further behind. With a weak, uneducated, unconditioned workforce, Britain would only fall further and further behind. So something needed to be done. Along the similar lines, in 1899, when the Boer War started, a war in South Africa, 69% of people that wanted to join the British Army were refused a place in the army because they were unfit for service. This clearly is no good if there's a war on and Britain needs to defend itself. Therefore, something needed to be done. Another reason is the rise of the Labour Party. In 1900, the Labour Party was formed, and the Labour Party was a party for the workers. Clearly, if the Liberals did not bring in reforms themselves, then the workers would have voted for Labour and Labour would have become more popular. So the threat of Labour puts a huge pressure on the Liberals to bring in these reforms. The Liberals also want to win votes to make sure they stay in power, to make sure they stay as the government of the country to secure their position. People were poor, so something needed to be done about it. And various measures were brought in by the Liberal government. things were done to help children. For example, in 1906, the Free School Meals Act was brought in, whereby children at school were given a free school meal. This meant that by 1913, 158,000 children were being given a free school meal every day. Later on, medical inspections for school children were brought in. First of all, the treatment had to be paid for, but later on that was made free as well. Things were brought in for the unemployed. In 1909, the Labour Exchanges Act was brought in. This was a kind of job centre whereby those who were unemployed could go and find work for a day. This was very, very good. It improved the situation, it made things better for the people. It wasn't perfect, but it certainly allowed 3,000 people a day by 1913 to find work. It was seasonal and it was short term, but at least it was work. The elderly were catered for. In 1908, the Pensions Act was passed. It became law on the 1st of January in 1909. It gave people who were over 70 a pension. Now, this was great for those people, but it was quite a high age. And one criticism is that those people who were almost 70 but didn't have much money were not entitled to a pension. If you were married, you got 7 shillings 6. If you were single, you got 5 shillings. This was a great benefit to the old people and they welcomed it. About 500,000 people qualified for a pension when it was first introduced. If you had your own private income of more than £21 a year, then you were also denied your pension because you were seen to have too much money yourself and not in need of any support by the government. In 1911 and 1912, National Insurance Acts were brought in. This provided insurance for workers against unemployment and sickness. So if you lost your job or if you were sick and could not go to work, then the government would pay you some money. Which was great, better than nothing, but it wasn't enough to cover the cost of living. There were people that opposed the reforms, and one reason they opposed them is because they had to be paid for. All these things to help people didn't come for free. They had to be paid for. In 1909, David Lloyd George introduces what's called the People's Budget, whereby he increases taxation on the rich and the upper classes to pay for the reforms that he and his party are bringing in. This doesn't go down well with the upper classes, with the Conservative Party, because they begrudge, they don't want to pay their taxes and get no benefit back. They think it's a waste of money. Some middle classes didn't like it because they had to pay taxes again and were getting no benefits. Some insurance companies didn't like it because it was going against their companies who would provide insurance for workers. But if the government was doing that, there's no need for those companies to exist. The other group, which you might be surprised about, that opposed the reform sometimes were the working class. Because either they begrudged paying income into these schemes. For example, workers had to pay 2D into the unemployment insurance and sickness insurance. And as they didn't have much money in the first place, they didn't like paying it in. The other reason is because they begrudged and didn't like the fact the government were trying to interfere with their lives and take control and influence areas of their lives. They didn't want the help. Yes, they needed it, but they did not necessarily want it. So we've got the causes of the reforms themselves, and we've covered some aspects which were successful and some aspects which were not successful. We've also covered those that oppose it. It's really important when it comes to your exam that you think about who has produced each source in the exam paper and why they've produced it. Are they going to be in favour or against the reforms and why? You need to make sure that you're using all your notes from classwork, particularly the key data sheets, to allow yourself to have a full understanding of the Liberal reforms as a unit.